There are chairs over here. I've got some silver chairs I can bring if you got. Would you like to sit down?
I love it.
Sorry. There are always more chairs.
These aren't the most comfortable, but they're small.
It's just a person.
Yes, of course.
No, I'm fine. And if anybody wants to take pictures, please feel free to take pictures and tag me so we can put them on our series. We can put them on the website. The Colleen Kelly Eiding author website. If anyone in the back would like a taller chair, bring this back in.
We should turn them off for the reading though, right? Pardon? Turn off our phones.
No, we're good.
All right.
Send it to everybody.
Call ladies.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Are you going to do that?
Don't turn around. I don't know.
Cool.
So you're all going to be reading in front of you.
Is that cool? Or you want to bring that up?
Got to pull the light inside of these things ahead of time.
Someone sitting up here? There's
Chair and chair.
free chairs.
I don't bite.
There's a chair in the front of you. Wants to sit down.
Donna wants someone to bite. Can somebody sit next to Donna so she can bite them?
Is there something wrong with these people in the front?
No, look, there's food in the back.
There's food.
So we're going to give you a little bit of a soup song of drama, teen love, romance, horrors of war, and mental collapse.
Autobiographic.
From the Eiding show.
So we're starting, the first scene is the prologue, and it's set in 1750 in the Lake District in England, when it was considered a dangerous and wild place by the civilized world. And Charlotte, our main character, is 10 years old, and her brother Thomas is 13. They've come to Coventry, they've come from Coventry with their mother, Dorothy Bird, to visit their grandfather who's dying. On their first day there, the children are out on a walk, and a beautiful white stag appears, and they chase it for a while, and then it disappears. And when they get back to their grandfather's house, he's had a miraculous recovery. And the housekeeper declares, "It's the stag, it's the stag, it's a sign. You see, your fortune has changed, your luck has changed." And then 2 weeks later, the children are out on a picnic with their mother and grandfather on the mountainside, or fellside, as they call it in the Lake District. And Connor's going to read this, and she'll talk about a gill, hind gill, which means a gully, and two becks, which are streams. And the children have run up the mountain path, leaving their mother and grandfather below. And Charlotte calls Thomas Tommy, which he does not like.
A flash of white to the right of her brother jolted Charlotte's thoughts into the present. It was the white stag. "Tommy!" she called out. Her brother glared at her over his shoulder. She pointed, jumping up and down. He looked where she indicated, but the stag, startled by her movements, dashed up the path. Thomas scrambled over the rocks, pursuing the deer. Charlotte, forgetting her fears, followed on her brother's heels. Below, the children's mother and grandfather were just finishing their meal and heard Charlotte's shouts. Hurrying up the path, they saw the children running after the stag. Dorothy Bird attempted to call them back, her voice filled with fear for their safety. But they could not hear her over the thunder rumbling loudly above the peaks. The clouds that had gathered over the mountains now burst open, spilling torrents of water down with such speed that the stone kettles at Glaramara's summit overflowed in a matter of minutes. A wave surged forward, channeled between the high banks of the two narrow becks that fed Hind Gill. The white stag, attempting to jump the spot where the two becks joined, missed its mark in the rain and slid down the steep, muddy bank. There was no time to avoid the wall of water surging toward it. Engulfed, its thin legs flailing, lungs filling with water, the stag struggled to right itself. Thomas ran to a fallen tree that crossed Hind Gill. Perhaps he thought to stop the animal's progress, but he obviously had figured on neither the weight of the stag nor the force of the water. When the flood hit the place where he knelt, the tree snapped in two and Thomas went under. He came up entangled with the stag, whose thrashing hooves sliced his face. Charlotte screamed for her brother as she rushed along the bank next to him. Raindrops hit her face with such stinging force she felt they must be needles. Horrified, she watched as the stag and Thomas were swept over the edge of the cliff as the water hurtled down to Seathwaite below. By some miracle, the stag's antlers caught in a tangle of roots and stones at the top of the cataract, and there Charlotte saw her brother desperately clinging to the deer's body. She crawled out onto a narrow rock ledge, telling herself all the while not to look down. There, she lay flat and stretched out her hands until she touched her brother's arms. "Can you grasp hold?" she cried out to him over the water's roar. He turned his face slightly toward the sound of her voice. Blood ran freely from the corner of his eye down to his throat. She saw him nod. This made her bold, and she inched out a little further while wrapping her feet around the edges of the rock. He grabbed for her hands, and moving as quickly as his cold limbs would allow, he found a toehold. Then fortune turned its face, and the stag's body broke free. Charlotte fought with all her strength to hold on to Thomas, but the stag's antlers caught hold of his sodden clothes and tore him away. A terrible scream escaped Charlotte's lips as she watched him fall. The deer hit the rocks a split second before Thomas. The pearl antlers caught him, piercing his neck and shoulders. The torrent of water carried them downstream as one body. Charlotte lay sobbing on the little spit of rock. She felt a hand touch her back and looked up to see her grandfather's ashen face. "I tried to save him, Grandpa." She looked to her mother, who stood staring at the rapids below. "Mama, Mama," she implored, her voice barely audible in the storm that raged around them.
So now we have teen love. Okay. So Charlotte is now 16. And a few days before this scene takes place, Charlotte is sitting in a coffee house with her mother in Hotwells, Bristol. And out the window she sees this young, handsome British officer who she falls in love with immediately as he passes by. She writes a letter to her friend about him, to her friend Emma. And now with this scene, she and her friend Emma are at a ball in Bath. And Emma's been telling Charlotte about a family friend, James Clark, whom she wants Charlotte to meet. But all Charlotte is hoping for is that she'll see this young man and find out who he is. In the meantime, she's forced to dance with Lieutenant Harvey Shelburne, an admirer who walks all over her feet.
Her moment of peace was disturbed by Emma, who announced,
"He's here, Charlotte. You must come and meet him."
"Who?"
"James Clark, the young man my mother spoke of in the coach."
Charlotte left her seat, knowing that Lieutenant Shelburne would return to find her gone. That, she thought, would be the height of bad manners, and would pay him back for stepping on her feet. With Emma leading the way through the crowd, Charlotte fought the panic that threatened to overwhelm her from being in such a crush. She would not flee, she told herself, as she had done from Lady B's rout in London last season. That would be too much of an embarrassment. Relief flooded over her as Emma finally pulled her to the side.
"There he is."
She pointed to a young man surrounded by admirers.
"He appears to be escorting Lady Samantha Tolan, though why I cannot imagine. She's pretty, but so haughty and ill-mannered."
Charlotte felt herself grow exceedingly warm. She caught hold of Emma's sleeve.
"That's him.
"Yes,
Oh, that's him, Emma."
yes, James Clark."
"No, he is the man from Bristol."
"No, dear, he's from Devon."
"Emma, he is the one I saw at Hotwells, the one whom I wrote about."
"No, Jemmy?"
"Jemmy? Oh, my dear Lord, you call him Jemmy?"
"Oh, well, you must be introduced."
Oh, no, I cannot.
Charlotte turned quite pale as she took a step back.
Oh, fie, come this moment.
She pulled Charlotte forward. Just as she and Emma reached James Clark, Harvey Shelburne appeared, punch in hand.
Oh, there you are, Miss Bird. I thought you had flown. Oh.
Shelburne laughed at his own wit. Lady Samantha Tolan turned slowly and elegantly, looking contemptuously down her nose at Charlotte.
Charlotte Bird, the ribbon merchant's daughter, here.
At exactly the instant that Lady Samantha, in an attempt to snub Charlotte, pushed brusquely past her, Harvey Shelburne thrust out his big hand holding the punch and attempted to place it in Charlotte's palm. Lady Samantha's ample bosom made abrupt contact with Harvey's hand, causing the drink to fly into the air. It exploded onto the front of Lady Samantha's person from head to toe. Charlotte wished herself dead. As the initial shock wore off, Lady Samantha's face turned scarlet, and she let out a howl. She lifted her arm to strike Charlotte, but was halted by James Clark.
Dear lady, I am sure this assault was unintended. Allow me to see to your needs while you calm your nerves.
He swept Samantha off before she had a chance to protest. As he walked away, he turned his head and looked at Charlotte. His eyes were sea gray. She was entranced. He smiled at her. His eyes drew her in. She was perplexed and charmed.
So now, Charlotte is 23. She's in an arranged marriage with Audley Pruitt, her father's business partner. She's trying her best to be a good wife. They're on a business trip to Italy. In this scene, they've been called to a villa on the shores of Lake Como. Think a very romantic location. To visit one of Audley's customers. They arrived a few hours ago, were fed a very big meal, and went to bed. Her husband is tossing and turning, so she goes in her nightgown out the doors that lead to the lake and the moonlit shore, and she finds that she's not alone. Looking up, she saw James Clark gazing innocently at her, his head tilted to one side.
I pray I have not given you too much of a shock.
She could not speak. No words would form. There he stood with his shirt untied at the neck. His fair hair white, and with his loose-fitting shirt and white stockings, he had the appearance of a ghost. At last, Charlotte managed an utterance.
I am surprised, sir.
Would you care to take a walk?
Yes.
Charlotte found herself saying, not allowing herself to think of the consequences of accepting such an invitation. James led her to a grove of trees a short distance away. In the grove, hidden among the trees, was a domed structure that looked out onto the lake. They stood gazing at the water. Charlotte's mind was full of thoughts that ran and collided into one another. One thought shouted loudest of all. Whether this be a dream or reality, do not turn away. Choose to live. James kept a steady eye on the lake and began to speak.
Forgive my boldness, but I must speak of my love for you. It may be my only opportunity. Since I last saw you, I have regretted every day not pursuing a proposal of marriage. I do not know whether you would have me, but I was a coward. I do not have much to offer. What little fortune I have is tied up in Devon. My father has no love for me. I am a fool. But you fill my thoughts. I have longed to caress your hair, to touch your face, to hear your voice.
He turned and looked at Charlotte, his eyes filled with sadness.
I, too, have wished to be near you.
Charlotte knew she was overstepping any polite restraints.
It is an impossible situation. Kiss me, will you? Only once.
He looked at her and she returned his gaze. Charlotte's inner voice cried out.
Kiss me before my knees buckle or I flee in panic.
He put his hand on the small of her back. She moved into him. Her lips touched his neck where his shirt was untied. Her knees gave way and he caught her. Holding her gently, he kissed her on the forehead. She found the strength to put her arms around his neck and, drawing him close, kissed him on the mouth. Charlotte would have been hard-pressed to say if they embraced for a long time or a short moment. Their bodies touched, and like smoke from two fires, their spirits blended together, and they could not be parted. So we're still in Italy. It's a few weeks later, and James and Charlotte have become lovers, and he shares a traumatic war experience with her.
That I had stayed in England, Charlotte, but duty bound me to fight in France. Then, General Bourgogne brought me to Portugal. My first battle was against the Spanish forces that held the town of Villaveja de Rodao. It was 5 days of fierce fighting. Then, on the 6th day, we met no resistance. Exhausted, we entered the town unopposed and began searching from house to house. Corpses lay everywhere. Rats fed freely on whatever they chose. The putrid smell that surrounded us defies description. My commanding officer was a rogue who had risen by cleverness and force of will through the ranks. On this occasion, I walked by his side as he called out in Portuguese, "Come forward, surrender, you will not be harmed. Come forward and we will feed you." A small lad of 5 or 6 emerged from under the stairwell. He was barefoot, dirty, and dressed in rags. His eyes were open wide, pleading for any kindness we might show him. Before a word could escape my mouth, my superior drew his sword and slit the boy open. He fell at our feet, covering our boots with his warm blood. His murderer laughed. I was stunned. I turned and sought refuge in the first open door. The main floor was empty. I sat before the cold hearth for several minutes, trying to settle my stomach. My attention was drawn to a soft noise from upstairs. I climbed the steps and found a bedroom door ajar. I entered and saw a young woman laying in a narrow bed with a blanket covering her to the neck. She was beautiful in death. Then I saw something move on her chest. Thinking it must be a rat, I drew my dagger. I pulled back the blanket, ready to stab her attacker. It was an infant. A baby, nursing at its dead mother's breast. Charlotte, I did not know what to do. I stared at this little one flourishing with death all around it. I covered it again and left it to die with its mother. I could not bring it out of that house. There was no one left to care for it, and my superior would have skewered it, leaving it to rot in the cold. We left that day. I prayed to God to let the child die peacefully.
And our last scene, back in England, Charlotte discovers that she's pregnant. She believes in her heart that James is the father. It's been 6 months since they had the affair in Italy, and when James returns to London, they're together and very happy, but it doesn't last. He begins to act erratically, he has a breakdown and disappears. The scene we're reading occurs now several months after Charlotte has given birth to a beautiful blonde-haired baby boy. It takes place in Devon at James' family's manor. Emma and Charlotte have learned that from James' sister that he continues to be mad and insists on living alone in a falling down shack on the property. Charlotte goes there to see him.
Charlotte entered slowly, not wishing to startle James or to be taken by surprise herself. An overpowering stench filled the room. On the rough-hewn table in front of her was a single candle which she lit, enabling her to see into the gathering dark. The room appeared empty at first until she realized that a narrow pallet in the far corner was occupied. Did not stir as she approached. He wore no shirt. His back was to her. She saw scars and scabs on his back where he had beaten himself, but they were joined by new bloody wounds. Aghast, she wondered who could have done this to him. His once beautiful hair was filthy and matted. Twigs and leaves were encrusted in it. The closer she got to him, the stronger and more terrible the smell became.
James,
He did not move.
Jemmy, it is Charlotte.
He stirred, turning his head slowly in her direction.
Charlotte?
She started and gasped. Bloody scratches lay in rows down his dirty cheeks. He attempted to focus on her face.
Charlotte. Oh, dear God.
He muttered, dazed, and turned back to the wall, curling up into a ball. She sat down beside him, putting the candle on the floor, and touched his shoulder. She covered her mouth and nose with her other hand to keep from retching. They stayed that way for several minutes. Charlotte concentrated on the candle's flame to try to keep her wits about her. Finally, he began to speak in a hoarse whisper.
Lottie, I have a baby, but I could not keep it alive. I tried, Lottie, but it does not move. I am so sorry.
He began to weep. Charlotte, unable to make sense of what he said, urged him to turn to her. It was then she saw the filthy bundle he was holding close. She froze, terrified at what it might contain. As his sobs slowed and quieted, she spoke softly to him.
Jim, let me see the baby. Let me hold the child, please.
He looked at her, his eyes red and wet. The tears made tracks through the dirt and blood. He did not say a word as he obediently handed her the bundle. It was a piece of dark gray wool, covering something heavy and stiff. Charlotte tried to keep her mounting horror under control, but the putrid smell made it almost impossible. She pulled back the blanket and saw the body of an infant boy. Large black spots covered its blue-white skin. Maggots teemed in its nostrils and crawled between its small fingers. Charlotte stood up.
Jimmy, I will take the baby. You must rest. Do not move.
Charlotte moved slowly and deliberately towards the door and closed it behind her. Once outside, she fainted, falling into the mud.
All Eiding.
Tell them how far along this is.
This is about 1/3 of the way through.
Oh, wow.
You haven't even
Lots
met
of
the
fun.
bad guy yet.
Yeah, you haven't met the bad guy.
Or have you?
Well.